great to be here in Salt Lake City, and Utah, actually. But it's great to be in Utah, and I have heard so much about the Revolutionary Student Union, and I was like so anxious to be here, and I have to say I'm more than impressed by what you all do. And for anybody who's not in the group, please get involved with it, because when you know things are going on and wrong in this country and the world, but you know you can change it, you gotta do it. And it's always the greatest opportunity to get involved when you're in school, to study like the RSU does, because then afterwards, then you know basically what you're for. And then when you go to work after you finish school, then that'll be another great experience, like union organizing. I have been to Cuba 49 times, but you don't, and I never thought that would happen, but you don't have to do that in order to understand where you stand on the Cuban Revolution. I'm assuming that everybody here has a basic sense of, I don't know, support for Cuba's right to exist and have its sovereignty respected. But I would like to do this. I'll give a few minutes of a little bit of introduction, very, very brief. There's a lot to say about Cuba. I think I'd like to talk about the contemporary situation, a little bit of background, and take questions and have a lot of discussion. Because there's been a lot of news about Cuba lately. Probably some of you, I think the thing that really kind of shook people in the movement was a quote that traveled around the world. AP and all the mass media covered it, saying Fidel said, "The Cuban model of socialism doesn't even work for Cuba." And of course, the media wants everyone to hear that, to be like, yeah, we were always right, Cuba doesn't work. But in fact, I knew exactly what he was referring to. And I was not surprised to see the announcement, I think it was yesterday, that the government announced that they're going to be eliminating 500,000 jobs out of roughly 5 million jobs that are provided by the state, because most employment is state employment. But it's something that was coming and that they've been discussing for quite a long time in Cuba, and it's not a shock to people. It's going to be hard, but it's either that or collapse economically, and I will explain why that is. So, has anybody here ever been to Cuba? Who would be interested? I'm not proposing a trip, but who would want to go to Cuba? That's usually the response. Most people want to go, at least out of curiosity. No matter what they think about it, they're curious about what is taking place there, and they hear healthcare and education are free, which they are. But basically, the Cuban Revolution has had such a profound effect on the world and in Latin America, and also in the U.S., that it's hard to believe it's only 51 years old. Most people here are probably less than half that age. But in social phenomena and in history, 50 years is a very short amount of time, especially for what Cuba has accomplished in the world and Latin America. From their revolutionary outlook toward helping people, from military assistance in the African revolutions of the 70s, to right now having 28,000 medical doctors around the world, quite a number of countries, especially the 14,000 who operate in Venezuela, providing free health care, in Bolivia and Nicaragua. There are 3 countries in this hemisphere that have eliminated their long-standing illiteracy, and that's Cuba in the 3rd year of the revolution, Venezuela due to Cuban teachers, and Bolivia, which happened just 2 years ago. And that's the internationalism Cuba feels, but also that they have resisted U.S. imperialist designs on them for so long. When the Soviet Union collapsed and basically cut off the aid with Cuba in 1990, up until that point, Cuba imported $88.3 billion, about 83% of everything that it depended on in trade came from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. $8.3 billion. They relied on everything for the raw materials for food production, steel, wood, tires, tractors for the farms, insecticides, pesticides, everything that they needed for agriculture. And within 2 years, that 8.3 billion dropped to only a little more than $2 billion. It was already a country suffering from shortages and from the U.S. blockade. But with its main trading partner gone, the U.S. quickly moved in to try to do away with Cuba once and for all. And they bragged about it at that time. So in 1992, in November, Bush Sr. signed the law called Torricelli. And basically it tightened the U.S. blockade, the economic blockade against Cuba very severely. Because Cuba no longer could purchase or trade for the food and raw materials from the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe. For example, they used to import most of their milk for the kids from Germany, East Germany. And since they could no longer do that, they had to find new places to buy food and medicine. So they went to the Latin American market, which they hadn't done in many years. And the biggest companies they bought from in the very next year after the Soviet Union collapsed was U.S. subsidiaries in these countries, which are really companies of that country. For example, if there was a U.S. company operating by Argentinian capitalists in Argentina is an Argentinian company. But the Torricelli law said any third country subsidiary directed against Latin America is now prohibited from trading with Cuba. So in the first year before Torricelli took effect, Cuba had purchased it's about 900, almost $1 billion worth of food, very essential stuff, almost $1 billion worth of food from Latin American companies. The very next year, because of Torricelli, it dropped down to 1.6 million. In other words, the faucet was completely turned off. This is what the U.S. blockade is about. Not just a ban of trade between countries, but trying to internationalize the blockade against Cuba. And so Cuba had to engage in some very strategic changes in their economy. It was before this, what they call now the special period. The special period that they refer to is the period after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's really basically almost a war footing on how to survive in a new world, and basically a capitalist world, while maintaining socialism. And the reason I mention this little bit of history is because it has very much to do with what is going on today. It's really a continuation. And they had to find new sources of income, new sources of food, new countries to trade with. And so they did things that they had never imagined they would have to do, because they had a socialist camp before and no longer existed. And what they did was essentially develop tourism as a source of income. It was a very, very minor part of their economy. They didn't really have international tourism before. It was really national. And so they built thousands of hotel rooms because they said we have the sun and the beach, and we can, exploit that for income. And then they also opened up the country in a very controlled way, but they opened up the country to foreign investment. Something, again, that they said at that time they never imagined they would have to do. And the purpose of the foreign investment, it would allow essentially 49% ownership of the profits of any investment of that company from abroad, and even up to 100% in any strategic industry that Cuba couldn't operate. But it never really reached 100%. Foreign investment, and then because food was such a dire shortage, they decided to break up the state farms, which were socialist state farms, because the state could no longer provide tractors, oil, anything to run the farms with. They broke them up into cooperatives, and the people who used to be the workers of the farm were still the workers, but they were now the owners of any production that they made, while the land still is in the hands of the state. That was a very big move. But to give an incentive to the farmers to grow and work harder, because basically if you don't have tractors, you're just going to have to get your oxen and work a hell of a lot harder to produce food. It was all about reality. And what they did was, they said to the farmers, anything over the quota that you're required to produce for the state, for the rationed food, for the population, for the schools, for the seniors, everything that was provided to the state. They said anything you produce over that, you can bring to market. Farmers markets are going to be opened up, and you can charge any price that you want for it. It was basically going back to individual incentive. And they described all these changes. They were very frank about it. It wasn't like China, which said at one point, it's good to be rich. We'll have socialism with Chinese characteristics, market socialism. The Cubans said very openly, this is not, we are not building socialism. We have to be frank about this. That's one thing, is that they were very honest about the stage. They said, we're using capitalist style reforms in order to preserve the socialist gains and survive to a point where we can then restore